more people employed with a rising unemployment rate. So keep that in mind. The unemployment rate is determined by several variables, one of which is new entrants into the labor force. Every day there is someone who hits a point in his or her life where it says, I'm ready to go to work. And if that person can't find a job, and then they become part of the BLS survey, the unemployment rate goes up. And so every day there are people who are entering the labor force for the first time. Then when things begin to feel a little bit better, when the hemlines go up a bit, when things begin to feel a little bit better, there are people who were discouraged about looking for a job. They had tried and couldn't find anything. So when we get to a recovery, people who had stopped looking and therefore were not counted as unemployed begin to look again. Those workers that are called discouraged workers re-enter the labor force. And so we can have a combination then of rising employment and things feeling better, but also rising unemployment rate because of that. And right now we're sort of frozen at 9.7%. Three indicators that I consider to be key indicators as you try to say, well, what's really going on out there? The first one that you see in this panel, the top two, are developed by the Institute for Supply Chain Management, and the one in the upper left is for the manufacturing economy. Now, this is data that comes out monthly. We don't get much data on the national economy monthly that enables us to sort of make an all-encompassing statement about how the economy is doing. There's a magic number in terms of how the data are treated, and the magic number is 50. So anytime there is a value less than 50, we have a shrinking economy. When the value is 50, we've got an economy that is dead in the water. Greater than 50, expanding. And so if you look at your upper left, that is for the manufacturing economy. We're well above 50, have been for a sequence of months now, and you see that shape which I've referred to before in some of my presentations to you, the caterpillar economy. It's sort of bumpy, but it's moving in the right direction. Now, over on the right is the non-manufacturing economy. That's everything else. That's the services economy, which is the biggest part of the nation's economy. That's everything else. That indicator has also broken through 50, as you can see, and now we have a sequence of observations that indicate for both sectors of the economy we are in an expansion phase from a low level of activity. Down at the bottom, to give you a feel for how low the level is, this is industrial production data. It is produced by the Federal Reserve Board monthly. This is all of the mines, public utilities, and manufacturing plants in America, and they attempt to measure their output. And you can see that industrial production is rising from a very low level. That is, it's headed in the right direction. But then if you let your eyes go back up to the starting point, which would have been there at about December of 2007, when this stuff was sort of at a peak and then falls, you will see how far we have fallen. So we have an economy that is weakened. We are operating at a low level, but the patient has a stronger heartbeat, breathing regularly. Who knows, maybe getting up and walking a bit, maybe with a cane or someone holding on to an elbow. But we have an economy that is growing again from a weakened level. When people talk about a recession and whether we have one or whether it is ending, they often do what is called a 4D analysis. And the 4 Ds is depth, how deep is the recession, duration, how long has it lasted, what might be its shape in terms of duration, diffusion, to what extent has the slowdown spread itself across the entire economy, how diffuse is it, and then a measure of despair. How do people feel out there? So I'm showing you data that point to all four of those questions, depth, duration, diffusion, and despair. That first panel, we looked at this in January when I was here. But that first panel, which looks like a ball of spaghetti that someone let go of, what you're seeing there, the colors are not real clear on the screen, but it is on the handout. Those are patterns for every recession that has taken place in the U.S. since 1948. So we're looking at 11 sets of data there. And if you pick one of those, you will be able to see its origin. That is, where were we when it started? How far down did it go? What's the depth? And then how long did it take to recover? That's the duration. Now, the one that we are in right now, there's a box pointing to it. We are now at about 26 months since the kickoff. You can see that its depth now exceeds the depth of any of the previous recessions. And its shape, and these things often turn out to be symmetrical, its shape suggests to us that it's a long trip back to the starting point, better than 2 years to go to get back. And so when we talk about depth and duration, we've got a long one. We have a long trip back from a low level. Now, then what about diffusion? The Bureau of Labor Statistics generates data every month for 257 industries in the United States as to whether those industries each are expanding or contracting their labor force. Once again, the magic number is 50. Now, it's 271 industries. And I'm showing you what that data looked like through February. In February, we were at 48.4. In other words, we are smelling 50. If we were at 50, that would mean half of the industries in America are still laying off workers and half are hiring workers. So we're getting right to the 0 point in terms of diffusion. Despair, this is the Consumer Confidence Index. 1985 is 100. That's the way the index is constructed. If you look at this, you see that the last reading was there in the 60s. That's a pretty high level of despair. Now, in statistical work that I have done, I've tried to decompose or explain the Consumer Confidence Index. In other words, what lies behind this? And the variable that I have found most reliable in forecasting what the confidence index will be, the variable that I found to be most reliable is the unemployment rate. And so long as we have a fairly high unemployment rate, I think we can place a bet that there will still be a high level of despair. Of course, it's common sense that that would be the case. When that unemployment rate begins to turn down, then we would expect to see consumer confidence rising. Right now, the expansion in employment, notice the total was higher in February. The expansion is taking place in one particular category, temporary workers. Firms like Manpower Incorporated, which is probably the second largest employer in the United States after the U.S. Postal Service. Manpower Incorporated is providing workers on a contract basis, temporary workers. Firms that have been experiencing the trouble of a deep recession are now trying to make a decision. Will I hire someone or not? Now, there are probably a lot of people in this room, I'm one of you, who ran a business at one point. I was in business for 15 years. And so I know the pleasure that comes from being able to hire a new employee at a firm, to welcome someone in and introduce them to everybody that works there. And in a way have a little bit of a celebration because the business is strong enough to be adding another employee. Of quite often the person that has been hired is someone you might know. It may be someone from your neighborhood or your community or your church or your synagogue. That is, often for small business, we had 50 employees. For small businesses, you know each other pretty well. I also know the pain of having to terminate employees, people that you were so proud to have on your payroll. And now, through no fault of theirs, difficulties have come, and for the firm to survive, you got to cut back. All right, now, fast forward to this current situation. And you've got countless firms out there across America who have experienced this recession and the pain of laying off people. And now, do you really want to bring a permanent employee back on the payroll? What data are you going to look at to give you some certainty that the recovery is for real and not part of a stimulus? That is, do you want to hire permanent employees in a stimulated economy? And I think the answer is no. I'll call Manpower Incorporated. I'll get some temporary workers until there is greater certainty. Then I will be more comfortable. But even before doing that, what typically takes place is let's extend the hours of work before we put someone else on the payroll. In other words, to minimize the risk of pain in human relations that comes in working with people and managing people. And we're sort of in that phase right now. We have the average work hour, average hours worked in a week. That has gone up. And now we're in phase 2. More temporary employees are being added. Phase 3, bring them on as permanent employees. And so we'll probably be getting close to phase 3 as we move along. Now, something that is somewhat bedeviling to me. The strength of a recovery in the past has been systematically associated with the depth of the decline. The deeper the decline, the greater the power of the recovery. That is, if in a recession GDP growth falls, or the level of GDP, let's put it that way, falls 3%, then you could sort of predict that the pace of recovery in the first 2 quarters after recovery would be high. Well, it's sort of easy to have a high percentage growth when you're starting from a low number. You know, that's like saying the year when we had the largest growth in the Dow Jones average in the United States was 1933. It hasn't been beaten since. So if you want to see a phenomenal recovery of a portfolio, go back to 1933. Of course, the portfolio was worthless in 1932. And so you get this huge percentage growth. But here's the thing that is bedeviling to me. I'm showing you this relationship for all of the previous recessions, and you can see when you fit a line through them, the line says, the harder the fall, the sharper the bounce back. Now, for this particular recession, we'd have to extend the chart. This one just goes to 3.5% decline in real GDP from the peak. We're at 5% in holding. All right, so we're out beyond that. That would suggest that in the next 2 quarters, we would see maybe 8, maybe 10% GDP growth. You're shaking your head. Tell me what you're thinking when I said that. You're not agreeing. Yeah, all right. So you're not agreeing. You say, dream on, Yandle. We're not going to see it. Well, why aren't we going to see it? I mean, if we could look at some data, what part of the data tell us we're not going to see it? Or in the interest of time, let me suggest what it is. It's the employment data. That is, we are getting GDP growth without getting much growth in employment. That says high productivity is out there. Every organization I know of, private and public, during this recession, has gone through some analysis, either formally or informally. Everyone I speak with They've all done the same thing. They said, we are learning how to do more with fewer people. Everybody's saying the same thing. A lot of people that I speak with said, we have found new ways to do things that we would have never thought of had it not been for this severe recession. We won't need as many people in the future. Well, that means productivity goes up. That is, the amount produced per person is rising. That says wages will rise, but it also says it's going to be slow building back those payrolls. And so as I look at this relationship, because I'm pretty oriented towards data, my brain tells me you better take this into account, Yandle, because even though we've got slow growth in employment, even though we have credit markets still frozen by and large, because there are not many credit-worthy borrowers, those two things are important. Still possible that this force will be pushing. And so I want to attach some weight to this, but I don't think it'll be enough weight to carry us to the top. Indeed, when I translate all this into GDP growth, I'm still below 3%. Real GDP growth for this current year that we are in. But I want you to know about this resilience. Now, when it doesn't happen, then I would go back and think about the labor markets, but then I have interjected the credit markets, banking. And as I talk to bankers, and perhaps you do as well, they've got some reserves, some of them do, pretty healthy. What they don't have is a line at the loan window of qualified borrowers because of the severe depth of the recession that we have gone through. So then that gets to be a question, well, what about banks? Some of them do have reserves, some are failing, as this one from 1929, this photograph suggests. Last time when we were together, I had some questions, and I indicated that I would do a little digging about what might be called the second shoe, however many shoes there are in a recession. All right. The first shoe to drop was residential housing and everything associated with it, construction, contracting, suppliers. The second shoe is commercial lending, and so I wanted to dig into that with you. And what you have here are some sentences I will not read to you, but if you will look at those, you will see that the commercial and real estate lending activity for the nation fell dramatically during this recession. And then you ask, who holds the loans out there among banks? And if you let your eyes scan those sentences a little bit, you will see that the small community banks were the banks in the sector specializing in commercial and real estate lending. A larger percentage of their portfolio was invested in those kinds of loans. Some of it might be a strip mall shopping center, or it might be professional offices for doctors and dentists and psychologists, or it might be a new housing development. But the typical community bank is heavy on this stuff. All right, now the second shoe is dropping. People are getting behind on those loans. Bankruptcies are rising for the developers and the owners of commercial property. And so then that gets to raise the question, well, what is that going to do for bank failures? I'm showing you data from FDIC. We start in December of 1990, and the last observation is for June of 2009. And those are the banks that are in trouble. That FDIC worries about. These are the problem institutions. I guess the thing that surprised me when I was putting the data together was, in a way, how good it looks now relative to 1990. All right. In other words, there are a lot of banks in trouble, but it sure looks a whole lot better than it did back in 90 and 91. So there are about 400 banking institutions in America that are on the FDIC's troubled list. And some good number of those will go belly up. And when they do, they will be merged with other banks, and the next day they will be in business taking care of their customers the same way they were the day before.
Can you guess what the December number is going to be? I know the last number was June.
Yes, that's right. The December number will be higher. in terms of, the question was what will the December number look like? It'll be higher in terms of troubled banks, and probably if we had a listing of bank failures, it would have risen somewhat. And it will be primarily community banks that are bearing the brunt of this problem that we are talking about. Now, this is showing you what has happened to FDIC's saving, their little bundle of money that they use in their insurance pool to pay off, to protect depositors from losses. And during those years when we didn't have many troubled banks, it was so good in some of these years that the FDIC stopped charging the insurance premium because they were building up a huge pool of money. Hey, we can lower our rates, or you don't even have to buy insurance anymore. Things are so good, let the good times roll. Well, now what do you suppose they have done? Not only have they raised their rates, which is the sensible thing to do, you're having to pay next year's in advance. And so the banks that are sort of staggering, and some walking rather well, are being hit with double premiums in order to build back. And don't spend too much time on this. You've got the chart, but it's basically the point where you are worried about is zero. That's where there's no more money in the insurance pool. And as you can see, we were headed there at a pretty high speed while banks were failing across the country, which would have, had we gotten there, it would have called for yet one more form of bailout to bail out the FDIC. Now, picking up on this theme of deficits, quite a number of years ago, James Buchanan and Richard Wagner wrote a book titled Democracy in Deficit. The question that they were focusing on was a rather big one, but yet a simple question. Why is it that democracies, through time, everywhere, tend to run deficits? Why is it? And it doesn't matter whether they're big R's, Republicans, big D's, Democrats in the majority. Why is it that systematically democracies operate in a deficit? That was their question. Now, I expect that you could very quickly give me the answer that they talked about. What is it about a democracy that automatically generates deficits? Anybody?
The benefit is short-term and the pain is long-term, so that they don't have to deal with the ramifications that would get.
All right, so you've got a horizon problem. That is, I run for office. I'm serving a 2-year term. I hope to get reelected, but nonetheless, in order to get reelected, I need to do something for the wonderful people who sent me. And that is, I've got to sponsor a bill or get with some people who will sponsor a bill that will help bring something to my district or to my state if I'm a senator serving a longer term. So you've got that, what is called the horizon problem. Don't expect to be around long enough, I'd like to really engage in something that has a 20-year profile to it. So there's that. What else? What is it about the democracy and running for office under our Constitution which predicts that year in, year out, deficits will grow or not go down? There's that one. I alluded to the other one, and you did as well, and that is, I've got to bring home the bacon. And so even if we're in deficit when I get elected, in order for me to keep my job, I've got to bring something back. And there's something else. When I ran for office, I took an oath. You remember what it was? Typically, what is the oath that I take when I run for office? No new taxes. And so those two things, no new taxes and bring home the bacon and a horizon problem, feed into a dynamic which George Mason University is famous for, called public choice, feeds into a public choice dynamic that systematically is generating deficits. And so then you say, well, if you wanted to do something about the deficit problem, what would it be? Because we've done all kinds of things over the years. Graham Rudman Hollings was one of the more famous ones. Pay-go, pay as you go, whatever. That is, there's always something, but this dynamic is still there. Now, this just gives you some data. Here's the federal deficit going back to 1930 and coming forward to 2010. And as a percent of GDP, and here are these wonderful World War II years. And by George, the war ends, and by George, the thing goes away. And so this dynamic that I'm talking about generates occasional, that is, these bars below the line, those are surpluses. All the other bars are deficits. Now, if my presidential history is right, you've got Democrats and Republicans represented in that data. All of them are systematically doing deficits in a way that's either the encouraging or discouraging part of the problem. That is, you can't elect another party into office and say, that's going to solve the deficit problem. At least that's what the data say. So here we are out here at 2010. As a percentage of GDP, we're getting on up there to what some people consider to be the unsafe level of 10% or higher. And that's when Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch's begin to say, I think you better do something about your spending habits. Here's, as a percentage of GDP, 1792 forward. And here's that wonderful, the 40s and so forth. And now here we are. We're creeping back up. It's almost as if we are running a World War II economy, at least in terms of the spending habit that we have and the dynamic that seems to keep it in place. And now this is our debt per capita, so that every man, woman, and child, at least as measured in these $2,000, has a little debt of $40,000. But I doubt when you do a balance sheet, if you apply for a loan or a mortgage, I doubt you put that on your application. When they say, how much money do you owe? Probably nobody has ever said, oh, and by the way, I owe $40,000 as a citizen of the United States. Well, why don't we? Why don't we? It's because we really don't believe we owe it. I don't believe I owe it. And I don't caution my sons and my daughters, say, look, children, you better put some money to one side because across the three of you, you now owe $120,000. How much do you have in your savings account? Nobody does that. In a sense, it's so what? So what? As long as those good Chinese will buy our bonds and send us money, we will just keep consuming more than we produce and let the good times roll. So what? And gee whiz, the interest that we're having to pay is trivial. Interest rates are low. So let's just keep borrowing and let's just keep running it. It's just a number. Doesn't mean anything to me. Now, the thing about the Chinese is that they have stopped buying our bonds. People say, oh, as long as they buy our bonds, we can keep going. This is the most recent data. They're not buying them, at least in the most recent period. Now, that doesn't mean they've stopped. They may just be tidying up their balance sheets. But here's the most recent data that's coming out to October of 2009. We're just bouncing along there in their portfolio at a zero level. Well, the Japanese are buying them, and a lot of other people are buying, but guess who's really buying the bonds now? We are. We are. We American citizens and American banks and industrial firms who have huge amounts of cash, in some cases, on hand, they're buying United States government debt because there's not much else they can invest in that's going to give them any kind of certain return. So we're still left with this, so what? What difference does it make? If we have this deficit habit, and we've had it a long time, I mean, if you want to go back and say, well, we've only had it since 1790, that's a pretty long time. Or if you say we've only had it since the 1930s, that's a pretty long time. So what? We've had this habit a long time, and not just us, every other democracy tends to have this habit. And life is going on. I can still buy a PT Cruiser every now and then, and I can get on the train and come to Washington and go to see Porgy and Bess over at the Kennedy Center and have a beer down at the Capital City Brewery. Oh, gosh, Moses, isn't life good? Don't bother me about this $40,000 that I owe. And for those of you who haven't done it, and maybe you have, I'll interject here, let me encourage you to get on a train coming out of Union Station, ride down to New Orleans if you really want to make a long trip. But the main reason for the trip is to go through the Shenandoah Valley. It is beautiful right now. And so if you were coming back from New Orleans to Washington, you would go to the breakfast car about at Charlottesville. And you could sit and look out the windows at this beautiful countryside. And if somebody said, do you know you owe $40,000 of the federal debt? You would say, come on, get out of here. But it's a beautiful scene that is out there, and sometimes we tend to forget that. But so what? Now, when we look at this data to see, well, what difference do deficits make? What do you think the deficits have funded most of the time? Not all of the time, but most of the time. As they have gone up, what has been the purpose of the deficit? What have we spent the money on? Highways, transportation, infrastructure, war, health care. If we look at the categories, what we see is that what has shrunk as the deficits have gotten larger are the fundamental activities of government. Highways, schools, education, infrastructure, ports, real stuff. That's gotten squeezed out. The deficits have gotten larger. And now we get back to the person who runs for office with a short-term profile. What can I do quickly that will mean something to people in my district? And a lot of that has gotten translated into enhancements of Medicare, enhancements of Medicaid, other kinds of activities which are transfers of income for spending purposes. Now, it's kind of crazy, but when I was growing up, and I was just hoping that I would live long enough to be able to get a driver's license and we wouldn't run out of oil. I mean, even then, gee whiz, you know, I'm ancient. But way, way back when I was 14 or 15, the geniuses that worked for the U.S. Geological Survey said we were going to run out of oil. And that 1936 Ford that we had sitting in the backyard would just be sitting out there rusting. And I used to wonder, will I ever have the occasion to be able to drive because the experts say we're running out? And then everybody would say, well, you know there's a finite amount. And we know the rate at which we pump. And we know that the rate at which we consume is going to use it all up. And so I used to worry about that. But my dad, once I was driving, said, son, don't ever use a credit card to buy gasoline. Well, it was unheard of then, or groceries. Why? He said, you'll burn up the gasoline and you'll eat the groceries and then you're going to get the bill. Always buy gasoline with cash. That was his rule. So pay for it with cash. In other words, what we have is a great national credit card that we've all enjoyed using, and what we have been buying is gasoline and groceries and food and health care, things that we consume, which give us pleasure, make life good, but there's no positive rate of return in terms of future wealth that would go with bridges and highways. And so in a sense, we've got bridges that are falling down, roads that are in disrepair, wonderful expansion of health care, huge amounts of money going into it, and that's the so what. As long as we can borrow, we can keep doing it. But the discipline to do something about it is the challenge. Now let's take a look at the states. Oh, I wanted to show you this one. I doubt you can see this, but the wonderful news is here. This map right here is for December of 2009. The colors of the states are indicating the level of unemployment. We have, those are octiles. I guess there are 8 categories. The darker the color, the higher the unemployment rate. Here's December. Here's the January data. I got it last week. That map is identical to this map. It's the first time since this Great Recession began that there's no change in the unemployment rates across states divided into 8 categories as revealed by these maps. Now that's good news in the sense of hitting a stable point. So I wanted to make that point to you. Now, something that Tate Watkins, where's Tate? There he is. Tate and I are co-researchers on a project. And this project that we've been involved with is one that is looking at the migration patterns of people across the states and to the states from international locations. So what I'm stepping into here speaks to this question. Okay, we've got an economy that has experienced a great recession, but it is still what I call the 90% economy. Roughly speaking, we've got 10% unemployment. Roughly speaking, 90% of the people in this country who want a job have a job. So it's a 90% economy, and 90% of our economy is a huge engine that is running. And so there it is. This thing is running. As our economy runs every day, it's slightly different from the way it was the day before. There are new industries. There are transformations of old industries. In some states and locations, the transformation is taking place rapidly. In other places, it's taking place slowly. And now I want you to consider yourself a person who is, what, Tate, 24 to 39 years old? A person who falls in the category of 24 to 39. Let's just pick a number. You're 30 years old. You live in Istanbul. You're going to be able to get a permit to travel to the United States and find a job. And now you say, I can go to any state in the United States. I got 50 choices. Now here's another person who's 30 years old, lives in Atlanta. The person in Atlanta says, I got to get out of here. I want to find something better than what I have. This place is kind of going down the drain here with this recession. I want to go somewhere else. But I want to settle in the United States. That person has 49 other locational choices too. And so what Tate and I have done, we have built statistical models to explain the determinants of movement by international versus domestic movers. And so we're watching them as they vote with their feet, and we're assuming they're not all idiots, that they know what is best for them. And if we watch their behavior in aggregate, we think we would be able to identify the states and regions of the United States which are weakest and strongest, as revealed by this behavior. One of the things that we used in our model is an index that's been developed at the Mercatus Center that measures overall freedom. Now that has to do with all the rules and regulations and taxes and lots of other stuff on a state-by-state basis. It also has to do with rules and regulations that have to do with behavior, whether or not the liquor store is closed down on Sunday, for example. So there's a personal freedom component to it. So we've got that, and that's gone into our equations as we have looked at this. Now, here's an outcome. What you're looking at here are the rankings of states from 0 to 50 states in terms of international migration. That's along the horizontal. How does the state rank in terms of people coming from other parts of the world to the U.S.? None of them wanted to go to West Virginia. All right? That's what the chart tells us. Not quite none. That would be a misstatement. West Virginia ranks 50th in terms of being attractive to international migrants. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Up the other axis, we are looking at where you rank with respect to domestic migration, and Louisiana is 50th of the states in terms of people from other states voting with their feet. You get the scheme? All right, so I invite your attention to the southwest quadrant. The southwest quadrant is where you have a high ranking for international migration and for domestic migration. This is where a huge population of human beings have voted with their feet, and they have told us where they want to be in this great country of ours, and they've also told us where they don't want to be. And so if you come from one of the states in the southwest quadrant, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, New Mexico, Virginia, Colorado, then you can say, I'm from the promised land. All right. I'm from a place where other people worldwide and here want to be. And that's probably the most powerful relationship one might find with respect to future prospects for wealth creation and income growth is population growth, because it's revealing forecasts, opinions that people have about prospects. Now, up in the northeast corner, that's the quadrant where people don't want to be, all right, among the four quadrants. So out of that quadrant, we have people departing, or from the standpoint of the internationals and the domestics, choosing not to locate there. Now, there's something interesting to me. There are a lot of interesting things here, but I get interested in this kind of stuff, so you have to forgive me for that. That's just the nature of my work. Michigan is sitting up there, very close to the median point, 25th, but Michigan is up there in that northeast. Everybody knows Michigan is losing population. But notice, Michigan is rather attractive to international migrants, not to domestic. So in our work, we have put in variables that help us to distinguish between what is it that's moving the international versus the domestic migrant. One of the variables that we have in our model is something that was built in our research called a knowledge economy index. It's a number. We've got a number for every state in America with respect to its burgeoning knowledge economy. Now, our knowledge economy is one that requires more brains, highly skilled, highly educated workers. If you want to just try to kind of put it into a capsule, say, give me an example, software development, for example, knowledge economy. The number one state in terms of knowledge economy is the state of Massachusetts. Give you an idea. There are not many other states that have an MIT and a Harvard and so on and so forth and everything that goes around them, and there's a lot of knowledge that's been building up over several hundred years in that wonderful base state. We put the knowledge economy index in our models where we were estimating the behavior of domestic versus international movers. International movers want to go to the knowledge economy. Domestic movers, somewhat indifferent. It turns out that Massachusetts, I beg your pardon, Michigan, has a rather sizable knowledge economy. You know, we think about it as big-time manufacturing autos and so forth, but there are a lot of engineers and scientists. They rank very high in patents per capita in that state. And so as we look at this, you get a little bit of a forecast about where the future growth of the state may take place. Yes, sir? That's right. That's right. It's changing. Now, there's something else that has changed. If we look at the Economic Freedom Index for Michigan, now the Economic Freedom Index has in it tax burden, regulatory burden, how many permits does it take to open a business, so forth, that kind of stuff. The people who built it have 40 items in that index. Michigan is looking pretty healthy in terms of the Economic Freedom Index. And so as we look at these things, we get a little bit of a feel for future prospects for states based on what Tate and I think are the most reliable indicators of life and wealth creation, and that is, where do people want to live?
So these ads we're seeing for the Michigan Economic Development Corporation are working?
I beg your pardon?
The ads for the Michigan Economic Development
Could be. Well,
we see that on CNN.
something is working. Something is working, and I don't know how much revision has taken place in Michigan over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of tax treatment, regulatory reform, those kinds of things. That's what would feed into our models. Summary of the outlook, you will find that there, and we can move ahead for our recovery to quicken. It means consumers spend, which means personal savings goes down a bit from a very high level. and that'll generate this growth. But I wanted to get to this because I was so tickled. Last time we were together, we passed out a questionnaire. You have one in front of you now, and I hope you will please fill it out. This time I've given you two scenarios to choose from as you think about the next 3 months, but these were the scenarios that we had when I was with you in January. And that first scenario, notice where we said the Dow Jones would be in 3 months. Do you know what the Dow Jones hit this morning? 10,900. Man alive, talk about a crapshoot, huh? But when I was here back in January, the Dow Jones was 10,160. And so you had a choice that said, hey, 3 months from now, this is what it's going to look like. The first choice is the most optimistic of the three choices that are before you. 14 people picked that one. The second one, 15 people chose, so there's almost an even swap there. The second one talked about a little lower Dow and a much higher unemployment rate, so it's mildly. And then the last one is the most pessimistic of all, and 4 people chose that one. I was putting the questions together, or the scenarios together, 4 or 5 days ago, and at that time I had sort of given up on whether we would see 10,900 as a Dow for this month. So I said, well, let's hope we get there in June. My expectation is that we will see 11,000 now by June, based on the road that we're traveling. So in any case, if you would, please fill out those. And while we are doing that, and also there's a questionnaire that we always ask you to fill out about the session and an evaluation of sorts. We've got some minutes left, and I know different people have different appointments that you have to keep, so by all means, that's understandable as you slip out. Anybody have a question? Touched on a good bit. Question? Yes, sir.
With the budget deficits we have in monetary policy, how can there not be inflationary pressures, short-term, long-term?
Okay. The question is inflation. We have 2 ingredients that would say it's unavoidable, which is lots of lax monetary policy, understandably associated with an economy that has been sort of shot in the kneecaps, and the money valves opened up, so there's a lot of money washing around out there. It's not being lent as yet, meaningfully. But then you have the twin of that in a way that is deficits, increased spending, some of which is being funded with printing press money, that is actually running the printing press to produce money, which is a rare thing in our country's experience. Put those 2 things together, that says, hey, inflation is going to eat us alive at some point. Why not? All right, I would still bet on inflation, but I would say it's a long way out for 2 reasons. One, we are operating at a very low level with a lot of excess capacity worldwide. That is, we can get goods not only from our own economy, but from the rest of the world, let's say at fire sale prices. And so that is there. So that is one of the reasons that I would say that we won't see it. The second reason has to do with the lack of credit-worthy borrowers. That is, money cannot be ultimately created until banks lend the money to a borrower, and that lending activity is at a very low level. Put those 2 things together, then I would suggest to you always have a little bit of gold in your portfolio. All right. I've got a little bit of gold. Newmont Mining is a gold mining stock. I'm not recommending that you buy stocks. I'm just saying that given the prospects for inflation, it would make sense to keep your eye on the price of gold. Yes, sir.
Last session you talked about the global economy as being like a train.
Yes.
Being led by Asia, West and Middle.
Yes, sir.
What are you seeing with that?
Okay. Okay. All right. The question is the world locomotive, that is the world economy visualized as a locomotive. What countries represent the engines that are pulling the economy, and where do we fit in, perhaps? I would say that China is still the big engine pulling the world economy. They have made decisions to slow down, But when they slow down, it's like slowing down from 10% GDP growth to 8. So it's still at a very strong and healthy clip, but with some cutbacks. Some of the European countries are weaker than are we. We are strengthening, and so I guess we might say that our locomotive is smaller, or it doesn't have quite as much horsepower as the China locomotive, but we're getting to the front of the train as this thing moves along. Another question? Yes, sir.
I saw on TV recently a report that said by 2018, with the retirement of baby boomers, there will be more jobs available than employees in the workforce. And was just wondering if you think that maybe this recession is a blessing in disguise with the increased productivity.
Now, isn't that a wonderful image? All right. So we've got the baby boomers, and they're getting old. They have already started aging to the point of hitting that retirement margin, and so you called out a number, 2018, and by that point, a lot of the baby boomers will have hit retirement, and that's going to vacate jobs. Then that immediately would cause you to say, okay, that's going to be opening up jobs for the next generation, and I think it's a safe bet that we would have that happen. In addition to that, along with that, I would say, keeping the door open for immigration is one of the vital things about our economy relative to the other highly developed economies. Ours is still young. Even with the baby boomers aging, the average age in this country is much, much lower than that of Germany, certainly than Japan, certainly than Italy. Russia is disappearing as a population. That is, they have negative population growth. So we have that strong health there. But yes, there's a dynamic there that is very interesting about the retiring generation. Now let's fold that into something else. What do you think will happen to labor productivity? The productivity of the average worker. All right, the old experienced workers are walking out the door. The inexperienced workers are coming in the door. And so with that dynamic, you would expect to see some decline, diminution in labor productivity, which says wages will go down because of less productivity. That's another feature of the transition. The other thing that we saw happen when the baby boomers first became driving age in the United States, what do you think happened to the death rate on the highways? It exploded. In fact, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration got additional appropriations saying there's something wrong with automobiles out there. The automobile companies don't know how to produce a safe car, and somebody said, no, it's not the cars, it's the drivers. It's all those people 16 years old without much experience. What do you think happened to accidents in the workplace? Exploded. And all of a sudden, the workplace was no longer safe. And we needed an Occupational Safety and Health Administration to get rules out there so that it would be safe for Americans to work there. Much of that had to do with early, young workers without experience where you have a higher accident rate. So we may get a little more of that as we get this transition. Any other question? Yes, sir. I don't. I don't have a real, his question has to do with the dollar as reserve currency for the world economy. I think the big issue there is that the Chinese currencies, they have two, the Chinese currencies are not convertible. And so no one in the world wants to invest in the yuan because you can't convert it. Our dollar is convertible. It is everywhere. It can be converted to anybody's currency who's willing to take it. And there are countries, I think there are 50 countries in the world that use the dollar as their currency. They don't have a currency of their own. The dollar circulates. The biggest denomination of the dollar in those countries is the $100 bill and the $50 bill. How long has it been since you've seen one? I don't see enough of them. But not only is the dollar the reserve currency for world trade, in a sense, it's the currency. So it's not just reserve, it's primary currency. Now, obviously, that is not the case for France, Germany, Japan, and so forth. But I don't have a real good feel. I don't have a good model that helps me to analyze and say, here's why I would predict there would be a change. I still think it's the safest game in town. It's the best roller coaster at the fair, and it'll continue to dominate. Another question? Yes, sir.
A follow-on to that.
Yes, sir.
Every now and then you hear news that OPEC is making rumblings that they'll switch to the euro, or
Yeah.
I mean, is that just to scare us, or are there reasons why they would do that?
I don't know. When I look at how the OPEC countries, let's not just put the OPEC countries, how trade takes place with respect to oil and its price. The model that I use is that they demand payment in gold. And so when I look at the price of gold and how it varies, it helps me to explain the price of oil and what is going on out there. And so my model says the Arab oil traders really prefer gold. Now then what they want to get is a ticket to gold. Is the euro a better ticket, or is the dollar a better ticket? Now what are we betting on? Rates of inflation. If I take dollars, will the dollars deteriorate in value because of inflation more rapidly than the euros? And so then it gets to be an inflation bet. Looking at the two countries, that is the Eurozone and the U.S., you see about the same inflation expectation showing up there. For us, it's deflation. That is, we are almost in a deflationary environment, which would say the dollar is a safe bet to convert into gold, because that piece of paper is going to be retaining its value. Another? Yes, ma'am.
When you say buy gold,
Please don't do that, okay?
well, I guess when I was in college in the 70s, the economics instructor said buy gold. It was $66 an ounce at the time.
Yeah.
And as a student, I always
Yeah.
remembered that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the time, it was like, I was working part-time at
Sure.
the family business,
Sure.
so
Sure.
it wasn't like
Sure.
I had a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I guess recently the U.S. Mint had one of those
Yeah,
infomercials on.
Yeah.
And I ordered some coins, and
Yeah.
and when the shipment came, I looked at the content of how much gold was
Yeah.
actually in the
Yeah.
coin. Because here I'm getting a $50 face value coin. That's I'm buying it for $20.
I got you.
So I'm still sitting back thinking. I returned it all, of course,
Yeah.
because when I saw how much gold content was really in it, that still wasn't getting what
Yeah.
I thought I
Yeah.
was getting.
Right. Right.
And when you think about it, does someone have gold blocks in their
Yes.
safe
Yes.
somewhere,
Yes. Yes.
or-
Yes.
I mean, is that how people buy it?
Some do. Some do. And I'm just passing on to you my own experience and what my broker says to me and what I do, and cautioning you. Don't use me as a model. But my broker and the brokers I've known say, don't ever buy gold. Buy shares of stock in gold mining companies. Those two things move in tandem. Move in tandem. The first stock I bought when I was a sophomore in college was in a gold mining company from the Philippines. The name of the company is Bengay Consolidated Mining. I paid $1.12. I still remember it, for a share of stock in that gold mining company. Now that was back when somebody could walk off the street into a Merrill Lynch office with $1.12 and say, I want to buy a share of stock, and they wouldn't show you the door, and so that gives you an idea. But so I would say, for me, I would be cautious, but all of the financial advisors say it's always wise to have a small amount, not a large, but a small amount in gold, and it is an inflation hedge. That's the only reason, just to have it there. But please, I'm not an investment advisor, and the best thing of all to have is cash at this particular time, I would say.
I'm still thinking about when you talk about the value of the dollar.
Yes.
I was reading a chart.
Yeah.
And it basically had what the dollar was going to be worth, say, in 2050.
Yes, 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 yes.
And the dollar got down to 10 cents.
That was probably one of those gold sellers that was turning out the chart, too, but we do be cautious there. I know we're running out of time, but your question brought back a memory. When I was a senior in college, we had a wonderful professor who was an avowed socialist. He took great pride in describing his reasons for being a socialist. And he was a wonderful professor, great teacher. I learned a lot from Dr. Anthony. And so two of my buddies and I, we were there in the last week of the semester. We were seniors, and we said, you know, what can we do to turn Dr. Anthony into a capitalist? And so we pooled our money, and we went down to Merrill Lynch, and we bought some stock in his name. And we bought stock in a company he had worked for as a young man. He used to tell us where he had worked. Libby McNeil and Libby was one of the major food processors in America. So we bought a share of stock in Libby McNeil and Libby, Dr. A.B. Anthony. We gave it to him the last day of class, and I never will forget Dr. Anthony putting his arm around our shoulders saying, you boys shouldn't have done that, you know. I'm really not ready to be a capitalist. So, but we had fun with it. Thanks so much for being here today, and as always, if there are questions that pop up where you think I might be able to provide data or information, send me an email or let us know at Mercatus. Do you have any other wind-up comments, any reminders?
Our next course is April 9th, and these comments are going to be in the Recreate right next door.
Okay. Thanks a lot.